So people are starting to flow in. We'll give a couple more minutes and then get started.
Okay.
Great.
More people joining in. Well, people are coming in, but we will get started.
Okay.
So, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on our second opening webinar for the Integrate virtual conference later this year. The business world is at a critical crossroads. Companies can either lead the way to a healthier, more sustainable version of capitalism, or run the risk of losing their way in the midst of escalating social and environmental disruptions. It is in finance and accounting professionals' interest to lead the way, and as a result, corporate finance is evolving. Organizations are upgrading approaches to accounting, decision-making, and reporting in favor of integrated multi-capital solutions. On our first webinar, we learned about a point of commonality between companies that are making the most progress towards incorporating multi-capital perspectives into their strategy. And that was effective partnering of the finance function with the rest of the organization. Today, we're talking about tools of the trade. The good news is that all the tools executives need to unlock stakeholder capitalism already exist. All that's needed now is for those tools to be adopted and applied at scale. We've got a fantastic panel today who will explain why and how finance and accounting functions hold the keys to this vital transition, what tools they can use, and how to align the dynamic landscape of potential partners and solutions. Our first panelist, Bob Willard, is a leading expert on quantifying and selling the business value of corporate sustainability strategies and has given over 1,300 presentations to corporate, government, university, and NGO audiences. His 6 books, 2 DVDs, business case toolkits, and extensive master slide decks provide further capacity building resources for sustainability champions around the world. He previously worked 34 years with IBM Canada, retiring only, so to speak, in 2000. He serves on the board of the Future Fit Foundation and the B Corp Standard Advisory Council. He was inducted into the International Society of Sustainability Professionals Hall of Fame in 2011, received Clean 50 awards in 2015 and 17, and has earned 6 Best for the World overall and 5 Best for the World Community awards since becoming a certified B Corp in 2012. He's an ISSP certified sustainability professional, is a Future Fit certified professional and accredited partner, and received a PhD in sustainability from the University of Toronto in 2005. Our second panelist, Richard Spencer, is the director of the ICAEW Technical Thought Leadership and head of sustainability at the ICAEW, the ICAEW being, of course, the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales. He joined the Institute in 2005 in order to set up the sustainability practice within the Technical Strategy Department. During this time, Richard has led on the Institute's thought leadership and engagement program in sustainability. He was the co-convener of the Finance Innovation Lab that in 2012 was named by the Observer and Nesta as one of the top 50 Britain's new radicals. He has also led on setting up the Natural Capital Coalition, now the Capitals Coalition. And before joining the Institute, he worked as a strategy consultant in the Natural Resources Division of Accenture and held a number of roles at NM Rothschild and Sons in the bank's Treasury and Natural Resource Project Finance teams. He began his career at the Bank of England and holds degrees from the Universities of Leeds and London, is a board member of the Social Return on Investment Network, an honorary visiting fellow at the Cass Business School, and a member of its Research Ethics Committee. He is also on the technical working group of the Climate Disclosure Standards Board. And finally, our third panelist, Natalie Nichols, is the development director at the Capitals Coalition, responsible for building impactful funding partnerships. She is currently on sabbatical from her role as global director at the RSA, the Royal Society for Arts, where she built a global infrastructure of affiliates and opened up the RSA's research and 29,000 plus fellowship to the world. Natalie began her career in the private sector, working for a FTSE 100 company, Wolseley PLC in Europe, and then built a highly successful socioeconomic impact consultancy within the think tank, the New Economics Foundation in the UK and internationally, where she's worked with over 100 charities, social enterprises, and governments. Natalie has published, chaired, and spoken publicly on topics ranging from social, economic, and environmental impact of community-based adaptation to climate change, to the importance of diverting women from the criminal justice systems, to the trends of the future of work and artificial intelligence, and the tyranny of oil. She's passionate about helping institutions put people and the planet at the heart of decision-making to achieve transformative change. Natalie will be playing two roles today. She will be a panelist, but also be somewhat of a moderator during the conversation. Please do, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A, as we'll try to get to them during the conversation as may be possible. And with that, Natalie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luke. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you may be. It's a reminder to myself never to go after Bob and Richard in presentations of who we are, because their career history is fantastic. So it's a real pleasure to have this conversation with everyone here today. And as Luke said, please do use the chat and Q&A functions. We want this to be as dynamic and as interactive as possible, and not literally just listening to us for an hour. I don't think I need to say very much about the current environmental, social, or economic situation that we are all finding ourselves in, not least small to medium enterprises and large corporations and medium-sized corporations. It's very difficult to think about what the next few months would look like, let alone what the next couple of years are going to look like. That said, Bob, Richard, and I have been working for various lengths in the field of understanding and trying to get nature and people into decision making. And one of the key ways of doing this is through the finance and accounting profession. My best friend is an accountant, and it was never that attractive when she was studying, but right now she is absolutely at the core of keeping her business alive. So we wanted to have this session very much with you as practitioners, as an audience, to discuss the things that we're learning and that we're seeing, and very much, as Luke said, maybe somewhat quite confidently, that all of the tools do exist, but it is a question of understanding where they are and also putting them into practice. So before we kind of delve into some of the detail of different ways of getting nature and people into decision making, I would like to invite Richard and Bob just to share some of your visions, actually, about why accounting and finance professions really hold the keys that are vital to transitioning towards a stakeholder capitalism model. Richard, if I could get your thoughts on this first, please.
Sure, and thank you, Natalie, and thank you everyone for having me here today. I'm not sure actually whether that you're right. I'm glad. I'm kind of glad I went second in that introduction. I'd have felt a bit small going off to you as well. I think Yeah, well, we've kind of reflected back quite a bit. So when this crisis hit, and we sort of said, well, you should never waste a good crisis, should you? And when we look back to the financial crisis, we hosted, the ICAEW hosted a series of roundtables across the world. One was held in Washington, another in Singapore and Dubai. And we asked then, was it a crisis without a legacy? And kind of looking back, we'd have to say, well, there was a legacy, but probably not the one we wanted. I think the way the financial crisis played out, it contributed to undermining belief in international institutions and organizations. And I think helped drive the retreat into nationalism. I think it'd also be fair to say that we didn't learn the lessons of the crisis. And more specifically, I think the accountancy profession and finance profession didn't come out of it well. I'd say we dodged a bullet. And we kind of find ourselves in this next crisis these years on, following a sort of, certainly in the UK and certainly in the accountancy profession, a series of corporate failures and audit shortcomings later, shall we say, and an accountancy profession, or a profession that's almost at its watershed moment. So I think for in thinking about, you know, what's the role of the profession, I know we're going to come on to that later, but on the role of the profession, in many ways, I kind of would recast that and say, is it now the time that the accountancy profession rises to the challenge and sort of becomes part of that solution? Because I think, you know, when we look back on today, certainly for the profession, we'll see that during that kind of first phase, if you like, of all hands on deck and the firefighting, you know, that we will be asked where were we, and then throughout, what were we doing, and recognizing that the crisis we face today, as you said, is just the sort of first chapter, and probably a small one, of a much greater unfolding crisis that could be captured as growing inequality, massive biodiversity loss, and climate change. And it's I think everyone's seen the cartoons that sort of summarize this, but it's kind of, you ain't seen nothing yet. And the sad thing is that we've spent too long looking the other way. You know, it's nearly 30 years since the Rio Earth Summit, and I think we kind of have to say, have we built a legacy we can be proud of, and have we secured the future? And I think to both we'd have to say no. You know, our last 2 years have been something of a wake-up call. Our Greta moment of grassroots activism and our Corona moment of a lived experience mean very much in the way that you know, Wilberforce said about slavery. You can now choose to look the other way, but you can never again say you didn't know. And I think that's been game-changing. And also understanding, which I think this crisis has brought, is understanding the interconnectivity of issues, that putting climate change, the change of land use, the intensification of agriculture, and livestock breeding, growing inequalities, and putting them in separate buckets has enabled us to ignore the interconnectivities. But now I think we've recognised the interconnectivity of all of this, and the emerging narrative of capitals, with its focus on how business and economic success are rooted in thriving societies and are rooted in nature, is a demonstration of how it's becoming normative, but also has been a fundamental way in which business has been able to understand how important nature it is to its success, and that a way forward from this has to be one that brings together economic prosperity with fair and just societies, and a way forward that's rooted in that carrying capacity of nature. Because if we don't solve this as businesses, our liabilities are going to be beyond measure and our assets will have no value. There is no prosperity on a dead planet, and there are no jobs. The business doesn't succeed in societies that fail. So I think the key thing about what we've learned and about that emerging narrative of capitals is that it's an incredibly effective way in conceptualizing nature and society as fundamental to business success, that businesses can start to understand their dependency on nature rather than seeing it as something they might possibly need to have an impact on, because there may be some sort of connection. I think capital's thinking has rooted us in our understanding of our dependency and our need to get beyond endless measurement and to start to articulate why things are important. So it's not that we have this much carbon as our footprint or we consume this much water, but actually explaining why does that matter and how does it connect to what we're doing, and that system-based thinking rather than putting things into buckets. I think those three things are fundamentally important.
Thank you very much, Richard. Lots of food for thought in that opening. And just to clarify, when we're talking about the capitals, we're talking about natural, social, human, produced. All of the Capitals Coalition works primarily across those four, though they are 6 or more, depending on who you're speaking to. So Bob, over to you. Why do you think that the finance, the accounting professions, how and why are they vital to unleashing stakeholder capitalism, building on what Richard's just said?
Yes, and thank you both for the context setting that you both provided. Complementing a lot of what Richard just discussed has been the legitimization of a new purpose for corporations. And I think that is really significant. Previously, if you asked an MBA grad what the purpose of a corporation was, it would be a pretty well reflexive repetition of the 3-word mantra that the purpose of a corporation is to maximize shareholder wealth. And that's been the purpose of corporations for most of the last century. Because of all of the issues that Richard just described and the state of the world and the crises that we are facing, there's a growing recognition that that's not good enough, that we need a multi-stakeholder purpose. So the purpose that is now being espoused by corporations or being encouraged as the purpose of corporations is to maximize stakeholder well-being. Last summer, not this past summer, but in 2019, the Business Roundtable in the US, which is 181 CEOs of the largest corporations in America, articulated exactly what that means. They put out a statement saying it's time for us to repurpose corporations. And basically what they talked about was a multi-stakeholder purpose. Multi-stakeholder purpose includes basically 6 stakeholders: suppliers, customers, employees, communities, the environment, and of course, shareholders. So what we're saying is, of course, you still need to look after shareholders, but also these others matter. So that brings up a challenge. As we try to figure out how companies are doing on fulfilling their purpose, we need to be able to account for their impacts on those stakeholders. How are they doing on that? Are they improving the well-being of those stakeholders? Are they living up to their purpose? That's where the accounting profession comes in. And that's how we need better tools to be able to keep track of how things are going, on whether we are adding or subtracting value from those human, natural, and social capitals, which are code for the employees and the environment and the communities that are impacted by the organization directly or indirectly. So as the purpose has evolved from being singularly or primarily focused on shareholders, we now have a bigger suite that we need to be able to look after and keep track of how we are looking after them, how we are improving the well-being of those, whether we express those as adding value to the capitals or doing better on the standard ESG or sustainability metrics, or contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals, if that's your preferred framework, but some way of keeping track of all of that. So the role of accounting in all of this, and the role of finance in supporting projects and initiatives that are going to help us do that, becomes more and more important. And that's why it's important that the CFO's role evolve into a chief value officer role as opposed to a chief financial officer. There's more than just finances that we're talking about here. There are other capitals as well.
And that last point, Bob, actually relates to the question that Scott has just asked, which Scott we will come to, because it actually relates to the next section, which is how does somebody like a CFO balance its capital? So to say that role is now about understanding relative value and the relative worth, importance, and the context of a business's impact and dependency is absolutely spot on with where this conversation is going to go. And I think this is basically the segue into, well, so, you know, we've heard the vision in terms of how the purpose of an organization is changing, and how the purpose potentially of the accountancy profession will change. And so what I want us to be able to talk about and to share with the attendees really is how very practically can finance and accounting drive this transition? You know, what tools do they have, and what is going on around the world to make this happen? Richard and I were speaking earlier, and he rattled off 10 initiatives just in the accounting space. So it is a very active global world at the moment, trying to get nature and people into decision making. But before I invite Richard and Bob to share, I wanted to share with the panelists, with the attendees, for those of you that are in North America, in September, so earlier, just very recently, a report was published called A Test of Corporate Purpose, and I don't know whether many of you were able to see, you know, when it came across on your radars, but it basically, I'm just going to put the link into the panel, into the chat function. It did an analysis of the companies' reactions to COVID and also to the structural racism challenges that have been held. And it compared their rhetoric with their actions. Now, very unsurprisingly, those companies that have been seen to be much more resilient and have a much broader purpose than just maximizing shareholder value came out much better than those that didn't. And there was no geographic difference between US-based companies or European-based companies. I really encourage you to have a look at those findings, because there's an aspect of naming and shaming some of these organizations. It's quite easy to make big statements, but actually to back them up without having quite a fundamental change, including in finance and accounting, is actually very challenging. So, Richard, what did you think is the role of the finance profession, and how can finance and accounting start to get, I think what you say, you know, get people and planet into numbers? What are you seeing in your space?
Yeah, well, you know, so I would say this, wouldn't I, being in the Institute of Chartered Accountants, but I think the profession is absolutely central. And if you kind of divided up where we are into 3 stages, you know, we had the sort of the emergency, and in which case the profession have within the economy act like enablers, and indeed within business. So they you know, if I look at our members, they've been working with all sorts of businesses, from the very small to the big, making sure that they understand government regulations, that they've been made. It helps sherpering them through furloughing, through government support schemes, through bounce back loans, and so on. So they've been almost like first responders. And then in the crisis, you kind of have that emergency phase. Then you have the sort of resuscitation, and then the rebuild. And I think there's a very important piece here, which is that in that resuscitation is to resist the temptation to go back to old ways of doing things. So let's not go and burn a whole load of coal to kid ourselves we're going to get the economy standing up, and then we can do the green stuff. the choices we make today will create the path dependencies that can lead us back to a better tomorrow. And there is plenty of extraordinarily well-informed opinion and analysis showing that a green and fair recovery is probably is a much better route. It's in a very short space of time. It's a better way of doing things. And I suppose there's a question here, isn't there, which is, what will the story be that the profession tells of the part it played in the recovery? And this profession emerged at a time of corporate crisis in the 19th century, and so has that traditional role of being there at that time of crisis. But what's their bigger role is it's about creating trusted information and insight, and that trusted information and insight informs our understanding of the world. And it results in the decisions that shape our lives. So there's often this kind of almost as a narrative that accountants are somehow passive recorders of past events, and that they create some sort of a truth. But actually, what it is that we create is some things are left out, some things are included. Our neoliberal economies and the accounting systems that supported that vision of the world largely left out society and largely left out nature. And there's almost a question here about that I think people might say is, are we at our Robert Kennedy moment in business? Are we at a moment when everything that we tell, the story we tell about our business through our financials, tells the world everything except which they find valuable about business? Because most of the things that we actually care about seem to happen outside of a company boundary. And I think there's a sort of second subsidiary point here, which is, let's not get too hung up on the disclosure. A lot of people always think accountancy is about reporting and assurance, and for sure it is about that. But more importantly, I think it's about decision making. And Natalie, we've worked in the coalition together, and the coalition was set up to answer the question, how do I build nature? And then when we became the Capitalist Coalition, it's society and people, how do we build that into our core decision making? And that's it's kind of conceptually easy to get your head around that, and we all go, yeah, sure. But that poor chap or poor woman who's going to be sitting in front of their computer at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, eager to do it, what on earth do they do? And that is a kind of really gets down to the granularity of the profession. All of this needs to be owned, in my view, ultimately by the finance function to build it into that mainstream decision making. The profession comprehends and makes sense of risk and uncertainty and opportunity. It helps craft a way through what at the moment is a storm. But also what's important is the profession is there, and this is the assurance and the audit bit, it's there to ensure that the promises that were made were delivered. That's it. And so when I talked earlier about a profession at its watershed moment, the role that the profession has played in order that trust was built is crucial. And we've got to, the profession needs to and is rising to that challenge. But it's about creating decision useful information that's going to the right place at the right time, so that the right decisions can be made. And I think we live at a moment where we collectively need to question if all of our institutions, including the institution of accountancy, are fit for purpose. Are they doing what we need them to do? Or in the case of accountancy, is it giving us the wrong truth, if you like? Is it giving us the wrong interpretation of events, so that the decisions society wants people to make, and the society has defined what it wants? And the thing about the Sustainable Development Goals is that is the world the world wants. So are we making the decisions that will achieve that? And I think the profession is fundamental to that, because without good quality information, timely and in a way that you can make a decision, without that you can't know where you are, and you can't know what decisions you're going to make.
Thank you, Richard. And in the chat function, in answer to Scott's question, there are a number of different tools that are available. But the ones that are there are two frameworks that are internationally accepted on the capital side. So the Natural Capital Protocol and the Social and Human Capital Protocol, which is how companies can understand their relationship with the capitals and integrate it into decision making. There is a lot more. We've just had a question that's come through on YouTube, which is about standardization, which I'm going to come back to, because then it relates to kind of the next stage of getting that information into the decision making. The other thing that I would just add is there has been some advances, particularly in corporate reporting. So there is the announcement that came out a week and a half ago now, which was towards comprehensive corporate reporting from the big 5 standard setters. I'll put the link in there as well. That is a really strong step for corporations. But as Richard said, I think what we're seeing on the ground is that information doesn't necessarily help with decision making. So part of what this movement is trying to do is to move from reporting measurement to reporting value. So there's lots more to talk about on that. But before we do, Bob, I just want to bring you in here because I think in our sessions earlier, I think you were the one that said accountants need to step up or get out of the way. I paraphrase. So how can the finance and accounting functions on a very practical level start to integrate the capitals into their decision making? And I know that you have various tools as well that you've been working on.
Yes, thank you. And it really comes back to the expression that Richard used, fit for purpose, whether the profession is fit for purpose. And it has been portrayed as a relatively conservative organization for good reason. I mean, they're trying to make sure we do things right, and it's taken a long time for all of the standards and methodologies that they espouse and train their members in to be developed and accepted and integrated into the way in which companies run themselves. And it's all good. The challenge that we have now is that we need to add to that base, not take away that base, but add to that base and include the accounting for non-financials as well as financials. People call